the Tall Corn Book Talk. I'm Nick Bergus, the books columnist for the Iowan magazine, and with me, as always, is Steve Semken of Ice Cube Press. How are you doing today, Steve?
I'm not bad.
Great.
It's fun to come in here and see you every few months.
So what books, what do you want to talk about book recommendation-wise today?
You know what happens as a publisher? I guess you'll probably never guess what happens the most. People want to know if they can get their book done, if they can get their book published by me. So I don't really mind that question because, of course, I want everyone to write, but I always have the feeling I should tell them something that they can do other than send me their book in the mail.
Okay.
And so I thought today I would share just 3 books that over time it helped me become a writer, and I've found other people to like them. And there's this one, I won't go into them a lot because if you're into writing, then you can look it up. That's part of the writing process, is to investigate and look into things. But one of them I always liked was The Triggering Town by Richard Hugo. And it's real, like, he does some stereotypical stuff where he talks about how he likes to have 100 number 2 pencils perfectly sharpened. So some of the advice is a little bit weird, but on the other hand, it makes you feel like anything that you do to become a writer is fine if you want to work that out. There's another one called If You Want to Write, which is it's a pretty much of a classic. It's been around for a long time. And, a book about independence and spirit. So it's about creativity and wanting to be a writer. And then this one is a real classic one too. I'm not up to date on what it takes to be a writer now because I'm ancient. I'll be getting my AARP card any day now, actually. I think I've got a few years. But this one's called Writing Down the Bones, and it kind of guides you through writing activities. So it's a real hands-on approach to if you just want to get started and don't know where to get started, just grab onto Writing Down the Bones and have your first shot at being a writer. Yeah,
you mentioned like the 100 number 2 pencils perfectly sharpened. It strikes me that oftentimes writers are just as superstitious as athletes, and like they have their things and they want them just so. And whether or not that's, I can't write if I have any sort of like noise going on, but you do sort of need to get over that, I think.
Right. Well, there's some people are their own worst enemies. They're like, I'm going to write a novel. And then they put so many obstacles in front of themselves that they probably never get around to doing it. But I think on the other hand, it's good to realize there's no one way to do it.
Yeah. So what books do you have coming out on Ice Cube Press?
2012 is here, right? So that means it's all new books. Yeah. So all the old authors are like, what happened to my books? But I still worry about the last books too. But this year, I have 6 coming out this year. Okay. And the first one, these are all galleys, so if you're looking at them on a film, when you get your copy, when this one comes out in April, it won't have this sticker on the cover anymore. But there's one by Larry Baker coming out called Love and Other Delusions. Okay. And it's kind of a romance twist on an younger guy meets an older woman, and things go from there. This one is called Their Time of Learning. Okay. And she is a Native American from up around the Great Lakes area, and she's really into plant medicine, and so what plants can do in that Midwest. Because a lot of times people will see an oak tree, and that's pretty good, but what can it, there's a tradition that goes into that. And so this is a novel that explains how that's integrated into the people of the Great Lakes lifestyle. And so it's kind of a coming-of-age young girl novel with lots of spirit medicine, plant stuff involved in it as well.
Cool.
Then in July, there's this book called The Divorce Girl, which is a novel, and it's subtitled The Story of Art and Soul. And a lot of people get divorced, and that's not that unusual, but this one has got a lot of twists on how her life changed when her parents got divorced. And it's funny and sad and inspiring all at once. And so, in July, we'll probably talk more about this one.
Very cool.
There are things happening out there.
Well, great. So let's welcome Colleen Bradford Krantz. She was a journalist who worked for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, the Milwaukee Journal-Sentinel, and most recently the Des Moines Register.
Yep, that's right.
Fantastic. So will you start with a little bit about what Train to Nowhere is about?
Well, many people in Iowa will probably remember when in 2002 a grain elevator worker in Denison, Iowa opened a rail car as they were preparing to load a train with corn and found 11 bodies inside. And the book is basically the telling of how they ended up inside this rail car, which was locked, and the story of the subsequent criminal investigation, search for the smugglers, and the effects on the families and so on.
So in your research process, sort of how did that go? Who did you have to talk to sort of build this story?
I started with a lot of government sources, requesting documents. Usually I had an easy time, but there were some times where I had to fight a battle to try to get documents because technically the case was still ongoing. But from there, I would comb those documents looking for names I hadn't found yet, contact information, and gradually started building around those people I found and their stories of how this played out in their lives.
So this happened almost 10 years ago. When did you get interested in researching this, and how long did it take you to sort of build the whole case file, for lack of a better word?
I really started after I left the Des Moines Register and was working on my own. It was probably around 2006, and really was chiseling away at it very slowly. I had young children and would fit it in as I could, and it was really 2009 before I think Steve and I started talking, and then the book happened. Yeah. In the meantime, we did. I didn't know if the book would happen for sure, so we'd actually done a documentary as well.
Yeah, talk a little bit about the process of doing a documentary, a film along with the book.
It was a really new thing for me. I'd always been in writing and newspapers, and all of a sudden I'm looking at this idea of jumping to documentaries, and I worried that transitioning to that format would be difficult, but because I'd already done almost all the research for the book and had started writing the book, it surprised me how easily a story can transition. I had to learn a few techniques and think more visually, but I was surprised, how much if a story's there, it can jump mediums relatively well. Yeah.
So what attracted you to this story?
When I heard about it after it happened, I remember feeling like as much media coverage as there was in Iowa and nationally, I still felt like I don't know those people in the rail car. I don't know what happened afterward, what prompted each person to try to come. It was really those questions that drew me in initially, and even some of the science, like what can science tell us about what happened when they were locked inside the rail car. There were no survivors, so that's all we had to go on. Yeah. But as I went along, it was really the people who are still around, the families or the relatives of some of those who died, and some of the government folks who were involved that sort of kept me interested in this story.
So when you were talking with some of the victims' families, what did you learn about sort of what attracts people to do take a very dangerous journey to come to the U.S. to work?
I think the most common thing you'd hear is what you would guess, that there's struggles at home, mostly financial. They are struggling to pay bills, to feed their families, have decent housing. That was clearly the majority, and they had seen what you see happening is they see neighbors coming back. Maybe one of them has gone to the United States and coming back to their home countries or sending money back, and they're looking at their neighbors and how well they're doing, so they feel like I need to do this even if I'm breaking the law. I did tell the story in particular of a boy from Guatemala who was really following his older brother. His older brother had sort of taken care of their financial needs, so that wasn't really what prompted him as much as sort of a teenage typical desire to see the world and to get to have his own chance to make his own money.
While you're talking about them traveling, taking the immigration trail, I know when I read it, one thing that really surprised me about the book was that from Guatemala to Mexico, that was actually an equivalent journey in and of itself to get through Mexico or into Mexico. And did you know that sort of thing before?
There's I felt like I learned more about it. And especially how dangerous it is on that border between Guatemala and Mexico.
Right. I guess I just hadn't thought of that.
Yeah, I think I read. I'm trying to remember the name of the book. There's a book by a Los Angeles Times reporter, and I can't think of the name of it now, but it really goes into that journey through that border region. And if it wasn't for that, I wouldn't really known much about it. But doing this reporting also, taught me more about really that's the most dangerous part of the journey for Central Americans is getting into Mexico first of all. Getting to the United States is, comparatively is easy or less dangerous anyway.
Yeah, that really surprised me for some reason.
Yeah,
I don't know why.
I think most people, we don't hear about it as much, and And I think most people are less familiar with that situation.
Right, because we just hear about people from Mexico trying to get over here, but we don't think about the whole trail.
Yeah.
So I thought that was pretty good. And I mean, I like your part about, I started with them, but one thing led to another.
Yeah.
And so it was probably hard for you to even figure out when to stop and what to include and what not to include, I would guess.
Yeah, I remember when we started, I worked with a video producer from the Quad Cities on the documentary, and I remember him saying, I can't imagine this story being more than a half hour when we put it all together, but there are so many side stories and details that you can explain, and so many parts to this story that by the time we were done, he felt differently, and it's just all these different people have so many side stories. And so.
How is working on a book different for you from somebody who's coming from newspapers where, 1,000-word story, I mean, that's a long newspaper piece.
Yeah.
Like, how is that different for you? How did you have to adapt to the new form?
Steve probably can talk about this, but I remember feeling like I was clearly having trouble not writing in this short, concise form I'd been writing in for 10 years. Get to the point quickly and keep the thing moving. When I was done, I worried, I don't think this is long enough. And what I had, as I went along, I had to make myself realize it's okay to explain how the border works here, even though it's not directly involved in the story. Mm-hmm. People are going to be willing to follow you along because they've committed to this whole book. So really, that was the hardest thing. And I worried about staying interested for as long as the book takes. But I found this story so compelling myself that I didn't have trouble with that.
So do you have more books planned? Because this is your first. So are you working on another book, or do you have plans for?
I'm actually in the process of starting a couple projects. One of which I hope could turn into a book. But first, I'm focused on a sort of a journalism ethics video project, which will be online, where I create mini documentaries on some news topic, and then show what I call 2 skew versions to illustrate how they could. How you can change things by like lighting and camera angle, what you cut or don't cut. Say you're doing accurate journalism, but still, but send a completely different message. And I call that skew tutor. I don't want it to be an attack on journalists as much as a illustration for citizen journalists, people doing their own reporting online and so on.
So how did that sort of concern for being accurate, for being objective, how did that play into your work on this book?
It was really important because I feel like if you pick up a nonfiction book, especially one that you expect to be treated journalistically, that as soon as you feel like someone's pushing you one way or the other on an issue that's as heated as immigration, if it doesn't match your viewpoints, you're going to put it down. And if that's not really productive, because you're kind of preaching to the choir if you're only being read by people that already feel the way you might feel, and if you convey some political agenda. And I did have people tell me, nobody I ended up working with, but I had people as I was looking for money for the documentary, I think some literary agents that I didn't end up working with, saying you shouldn't do this book unless you have a political goal. But as a journalist, I had trouble with that. I mean, there's room for those kind of books, but I also felt like to me it's more valuable to let somebody read a story and walk away to make their own decisions, because you probably end up opening more minds that way to different viewpoints, and it's more productive in the way I look at it.
Did Steve push you towards trying to be more opinionated?
Oh, all kinds of pressure. No, he was great.
No, I did.
He understood it, I think.
It seemed like some people did want you to, if you were doing a talk, like, well, I don't think anyone ever just came out and asked you, what's your opinion? But I can tell that people wanted to know what you thought in the end. Like, why didn't you put a chapter in the end and how you felt everything happened? But I could tell that you never wanted to do that.
Yeah.
That really wasn't the point for you.
I had a lot of people. I have had people at some talks, and one person I remember specifically saying, I really don't agree with how you handled this. Why wouldn't you use this story to, get Congress or immigration to do something differently? And but honestly, I don't think people open their minds if they feel like they're being pushed anyway. And immigration hasn't really changed much, even though everybody lists it as a very high concern every time there's a presidential election. Not much changes, and everybody on both sides seems dissatisfied. But I clearly get people who want to say, well, what's your, what's the answer here? And I tell them, well, if I had the answer, I'd run for Congress instead of writing books. But it's, but it's really not an easy issue, and if you people that have read the book say, I feel really strongly this way, but I did see some other issues I hadn't thought about, or just learn things about immigration that I didn't really understand before.
Did researching the book influence the way you think about immigration issues at all? Did it sort of cause you to recognize where there might be problems in our current immigration system?
Yeah, I did learn more. If you spend time talking to the families and talking to immigration agents, you really hear different perspectives, and from people who know it firsthand, not from politicians who are second or third sources. And what I hear is, people ask for the families, for example, people want to know, why don't they just wait and get in line and try to get their documents? But first of all, you just have to remember the culture there. They might not even be aware of, how do I start this process? Their neighbors just go. They know the smuggler that takes them, so in their minds, maybe that's the way to do it. Even they probably are aware that it's not legal, but that's one thing you learn, is that it's just sort of the culture that this is how you do it, and their neighbors have all done that. So it feeds on itself. And if you talk to immigration agents, they'll say things like, anytime a politician brings up amnesty, thousands more hurry here in hopes that they'll be here when it happens. So in their viewpoint is, if you're going to do it, you need to just say it and do it right then, because otherwise you're bumping your numbers every time you talk about it. Things I hadn't thought about before.
That's a really interesting issue. Did you have a point you want to make, Steve?
It's not totally off track, but it's. I was wondering if while you were doing the book, at any point you ever felt like someone didn't want you to report this story, or if you ever faced any resistance from anybody, like because you were dealing with government sources, or I know that some of the people that we have pictures of in the book are still wanted. And so I don't know if you ever thought to yourself, maybe I don't want to pursue this, or someone got in your way and you just said, I'm going to do it anyway, or maybe none of that happened.
Yeah, I'm kind of stubborn, and I did have trouble, but I don't think I ever decided I was going to give up, because there is an exemption because of it being an open case. They have a smuggler, like you mentioned, that was never, or several that have never been tried in the U.S. or brought here. One's still wanted, and as a result, technically, you can turn to this exemption for open criminal investigations. But what I found is most of the agencies I worked with realized that enough time's passed. It's probably not going to harm anything to release information. I did have trouble with several federal agencies that just did not want any part of this, would not release anything. I think the U.S. Attorney's Office in Texas wouldn't even grant me an interview when we were down there, even just to give an overview of the facts. So there's that. I don't know if that fear of what's this going to be about, or just nervousness you get, and I feel like they kind of turned to this option under the law of denying because it was open.
So I think immigration has become a real controversial issue in Iowa, even though, I don't know that people think of Iowa or the Midwest sort of on a national scale when they think of sort of the immigration problem. Is it as a hot button of an issue in Iowa as it is in Texas, as in Arizona? Did you get a sense of that?
I feel like people in Iowa, maybe because I should say, especially in smaller neighborhoods and towns, people tend to get to know one another. And in some very large urban areas, you might lose that. So this people would expect you might have more tension in Iowa. But I remember feeling when I reported some of this for the Des Moines Register that sometimes the opposite was true. You get to know your neighbors. Their kids play on the football team with your kid. They go to church with you. And you might suspect they're not here legally, but you don't know, and at some point they're your friends, and so what I found is it's sometimes people are surprised that small towns can actually be very supportive and open to the idea that these people are maybe not doing something legal, but trying to do what's better for their families. And I noticed that when we filmed in Texas, not because they're not sensitive, but just because they're used to these kind of tragedies happening in the desert and so on. They would say things like, "Why are you telling this story? It's happens all the time." And I'm not trying to say again that they're unfeeling. It's just that's in their news all the time. Maybe not this extent, but
they're exposed to it more.
Yeah, and in Iowa, if it doesn't land in our backyard so often, so they people tend to remember it and feel bad about what happened, no matter how they feel on the topic.
Yeah. I want to sort of change topics and talk briefly about sort of. Steve and I have talked about sort of the future of book publishing.
Right.
So we're going to have. I'd like to touch on sort of the future of newspapers. I think it's traveling down the same path. I think in a lot of ways that book publishing is, and that newspaper publishers are having a harder time sort of making ends meet. Where do you see the future of newspapers? Is there always going to be a place for newspapers?
Well, I will say it's really sad to see the changes happening. I left newspapers about 6 years ago, and it was right after that layoffs really started happening. And not all, but some of my friends who are still with newspapers say things like "when I get fired" instead of if I get fired. And but I do think that they are searching very hard for some kind of answer, some kind of way to use technology and combine it with what we're doing, or what newspapers are doing already, and turn that economic model around to maybe find a way to survive. I will say that I think there's some form of that's going to survive, because as more and more sources of information are out there, people I think already feel this need for who to turn to for good, solid information that they can trust. And it is going to evolve some way, but I think that journalists will have a role still in some way.
I agree. I mean, there's so many, I think it was kind of like the e-books. I think there's a lot of interest in them because they're new, and there's a lot of interest in this blogging and it's like independent news stuff. But at some point, people are going to pull back and want to know, like, I want to know that I can trust this person. So I see the news, like a news bureau or a news source, as adding credentials to the story. Yeah. And of course, journalism's not going anywhere. I mean, just like stories, in my opinion. If you start saying "once upon a time," people want to know what you have to say next. People are always going to want to know what's happening in the world. So the question is how they can continue that. So it's not a dying field. It's just a medium in transition.
Yeah, right? I joked with my husband that I don't really choose the strongest fields, because I was in newspapers and I left for the books, and now it feels like the same thing's happening. But I think both are going to do well eventually. I mean, they're going to find their way to fit with change with technology and make it work eventually.
Well, sure.
I was wondering because you're in journalism, you wrote the book, and I don't know, I don't know how you've enjoyed being a book publisher or not, but I just wonder if there's any surprises along the way for you, other than having a bad publisher, but you can skip that part.
No, I've loved working with you. You know that.
I know.
I think just the fact that authors, all, regardless of whether they're with a small, medium, or large publisher, have to do a lot of the marketing themselves. I don't think you go into it for that, but it is very clear that that's really important. Yeah. And I've learned a lot, and I've probably been slow at learning, but I'm kind of getting that you have to market yourself, which sometimes feels funny, but your book and work your way through the social media and try to help spread the word, because it's just what every author needs to do if they really want to help their book along and share the story.
Was that a challenge for you, like trying to sort of put yourself out there as opposed to just I am a reporter for the Des Moines Register, and that's enough? I agree. I mean, it really was, because I'd always been behind another name, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or the Des Moines Register, and all of a sudden other than being with the publisher, your name is sort of your business, and especially as you move on to other projects, and feeling okay with sort of promoting your business, which is your name. Yeah. It feels funny at first, especially when a lot of your social media is your friends, and you don't want to feel like you're pestering them, but you also don't want to, fail to share the story because you're feeling funny about that.
Well, she is not alone. That's one thing I notice from from authors, is I think that I try and tell them a few times before we get started that it's just going to be me and them, but I still think, and it's not a knock against any author, but it's a big shock to suddenly realize that you're sort of out there on your own. And I think it's a shock because, three of us are probably old enough to remember the heyday when there were readings, and you just, in your mind, you think that there's just, the authors show up, the hall's packed because Harper's paid for a big tour, which is how it used to be. But I just know from being around other bigger publishers that it's really gotten, there's just not that much money out there. And so the authors are really having to pick up and promote themselves, which I would be uncomfortable doing too if I were in their shoes.
Yeah.
I mean,
Sure.
it's definitely a transition time right now for that sort of thing. And I mean, like finally Colleen's book is a ebook or a Kindle now, and so things like that, I probably should have been more open to that at the beginning. But Nick has watched the progression of me go from hating those things to like, wow, those things are awesome.
Well, Colleen, thank you for coming by and promoting yourself and your book today.
Thank you.
And I hope you're speaking at Prairie Lights tonight.
That's tomorrow night.
Tomorrow night, and I hope that goes well for you. And
I think she has a new website. You want to tell them your website?
Yeah, well, and my author site is ColleenBradfordKrantz.com, but I've started my 2 new projects, SpickerBattles.com and SkewTutor.com is coming in the summer.
Very cool. Well, thank you for joining us again for Tall Corn Books, and we hope to see you again next time.